Good afternoon. My name is Karen with Compass Family Journeys. I wanted to do a presentation today on compensation. It seems to be one of those issues that is first kind of a top question that I get because it is a big part of the process for potential candidates. And then it's also something that is a large part of the journey for intended parents as far as what they need to budget for. So it's something that I feel as though I talk about all day long with many people, and then, of course, with legal teams and such. And so I felt like it might be helpful to go through what exactly is part of the compensation and fee package, what tends to stay the same across the board, what changes up, what the, I guess, industry standards are within compensation, and basically what the expectations should be all around when we're looking at screening a candidate, and then what the intended parents are kind of maybe assuming what compensation will be or what it will look like, and what surrogates are feeling on your end and how you're feeling about what has been the norm and maybe what's becoming the norm. So a few of the things, and I think I just rambled on about this, but a few of the topics for today is going to be what is base compensation and the trends that we're seeing in that, what fees are versus what reimbursements are, expected fees, things that are typically paid out when pregnancy is achieved versus what we call incidental fees, or things that may be paid out if that event occurs, what IPs think, what they're thinking throughout this process, and then what's negotiable within your package. So base compensation. I'm going to start here because this is typically the first question. What is your compensation? What does your compensation start at? So first off, what it is. The base compensation is going to be the amount of money that is paid to you as the surrogate for undergoing this pregnancy. Okay, so it's essentially going to be those funds that come to you that is what the intended parents are paying you for agreeing to do this and for carrying the pregnancy. How it's paid, this is going to vary depending on who you're going through, who your legal team is, but most typically, and it should in all cases be paid monthly throughout the pregnancy, right? Because you're being compensated for being pregnant, not for a baby. Nobody can pay for a baby. That's not part of the deal, but you're being compensated for your time, effort, and energy of carrying this pregnancy. And it's going to be paid on a monthly basis, and typically anywhere from 8 to 10 installments, depending on how that is written up. They are typically going to be even installments. So they'll start at, when pregnancy is achieved, soon after that, all the way up through the birth. And then what's it used for? So I'd like to tell people this is yours. This is nothing for this process, for the surrogacy process, should have to come out of your base compensation. The base compensation is basically what you're agreeing to accept in return for carrying this pregnancy. Okay, so that's the one facet, the one side of your compensation and fees sheet. That is going to be your base compensation. And now we're going to talk about your fees and your reimbursements, which is basically the other part of it. So what are all these numbers? What is it? What does this mean? So like with fees and reimbursements, these are either going to be payments that are made to you for undergoing certain procedures or like hitting certain milestones within the pregnancy, or it's paying you for costs that you have personally incurred for the pregnancy process. Okay. When is it paid? Sometimes with reimbursements, sometimes they're kind of paid on your behalf ahead of time, or funds can be sent to you ahead of time. Sometimes with reimbursements, we have to wait for you to pay and then you're reimbursed. So things like, yeah, I really try as an agency to avoid having people, have to pay and then be reimbursed. But one thing that I can't change up are going to be like for a rental car, because the person that's renting the car has to use their own form of payment. So something like that, we do have to wait until you've paid it to be reimbursed, but then you're reimbursed right after the fact. And then fees are paid basically once that event has occurred and we can prove to escrow in one way or another that that event has occurred. And that is when that particular fee would be kicked out to you. And then what's it used for? Uh, they're for actual reimbursements, right? So they're for things that for the actual cost of things that have incurred that are based on the pregnancy, and then fees will either act as like an additional compensation for undergoing a certain procedure or hitting a milestone, or to cover like increased costs that come up due to that event. Some of the different fees. So on this first one, I put the fees that we tend to see a little bit more frequently, things that are always paid out in some, pregnancies versus other things that might come up or have a higher likelihood of coming up during a pregnancy. So the first is going to be your monthly allowance. What this is, or what I tell people it is it's not extra compensation. I do hear that sometimes. It's not actually extra compensation. It's to make sure that all those little pesky expenses that come up during your journey aren't falling on you, right? We don't want to be taking away from your own funds for your own family. We want to make sure that the intended parents are covering those costs. So things like the gas that you need to get, to and from appointments, or if you can't fit an OB appointment in during your lunch hour or something and you need to take an hour or so off of work, we want to make sure that you've got funds coming in to cover that. If like it's easier for you to leave your little one at home for an hour long appointment and you just are like, oh my gosh, I just want to pay a sitter, to take care of that. Things like that. Prenatal vitamins. If you need like a pregnancy pillow or anything to just kind of help the pregnancy be a little bit smoother and a little bit more comfortable in some of those very uncomfortable situations. That's what that monthly allowance is going to be for. All those little things that add up where you're like, oh gosh, I thought that was just $20, but 20 plus 20 plus 20, it starts adding up. So that's what that is going to be for. Your medication start fee, this is going to be paid to you. Again, I'm going to preface this by saying not every single fee sheet is going to have all of these. This is just what I see as typical with our agency. But the medication start fee is typically an amount that you'll get once you start a certain medication within the cycling process. The way that I typically explain this both to intended parents and to surrogates is that we can't guarantee that anyone's going to make it to a transfer. While things, that's the majority of people will make it to a transfer. That's our hope. That's what we're working towards. Sometimes things come up where maybe lining never, cooperates, or something is found during one of those appointments. So the medication start fee is kind of like a small amount of compensation, we'll say, that basically is you're getting for your time and effort that you've put in thus far throughout the process, once you get to that point in the process. So that's going to be paid, soon to the embryo transfer cycle. It normally about 3 weeks before that embryo transfer, but it just helps, with some of those, especially with all those increased appointments and everything leading up to transfer. Your transfer fee. So again, this is, we can't guarantee that a transfer will work. We want to make sure because you've gone through a lot at that point that you are receiving some sort of compensation for your time and effort and energy and all those shots and everything that you've done. So the transfer fee is what you're getting when that embryo transfer occurs. Again, contracts are written differently as to if that's supposed to cover certain things or if it's just an additional fee on top of expenses. So you'll want to be careful, in reading your fee sheet to make sure that you know what that is supposed to cover. Maternity clothing. So this is going to be an additional allowance. With us, we have it kicked out in between 12 and 14 weeks of pregnancy. But basically, even if you've got clothing or stuff from another pregnancy, we all know that it seems like every pregnancy you're a different size or it's a different season or, my feet, it's always my feet that want to grow like a half a size bigger. So I always need new shoes. So anyway, that's just to kind of help with some of those costs that come up for just your clothing and your personal, kind of maintenance, I guess, with some of that stuff. Multiple speed. And so while we're big, kind of supporters of some or of single embryo transfers. Sometimes we will have people that will either do a double embryo transfer or an embryo will split, leading to like an identical twin pregnancy. So you'll oftentimes see a multiples fee on your fee sheet, which is essentially an amount per extra baby, which that we're always hoping that there's no more than one extra baby there. But we want to make sure that you're compensated properly for a pregnancy that is going to be harder if you're carrying more than one baby. So that's what that extra amount of compensation is going to be. Again, that will be paid out per month, stretched out during the pregnancy because they are compensating you for being pregnant. And then C-section fee, it's kind of for the most part, I would say most births that I see are still vaginal births, but C-sections, they do happen either because you've had a C-section in the past and you're having another C-section, or a complication comes up, or just I guess a difference within the pregnancy that would mean that a C-section would be a safer delivery. And so if that does come up, then we want to make sure that you are compensated for that, because the recovery, it's not as, well, even a vaginal recovery isn't that fun, but a C-section recovery is going to be more. It's going to be harder. You're going to need, maybe some extra childcare or some extra housekeeping. Maybe you want to have your spouse stay home a little bit longer and you've already used up, like his or her days to cover the lost wages. And so, like, if you want to keep someone home or have your mom come or whomever, it just kind of helps to cover some of those additional costs that might kind of occur during that postpartum period that you weren't expecting to have happen if it were to have been a vaginal delivery. So other fees, I wanted to go over. These are not as common, but I get a lot of questions on them because, well, they're not as common. So the first one's going to be that drop cycle fee. Again, this doesn't happen often, but let's say that you're cycling and you start progesterone, you're almost there, and the intended parents are like, oh, wait a second, something happened. We need to put everything on hold. And you've already gone through all this. And you're like, well, what the heck? I've already got all these hormones, my body is ready, and we're being pulled out. I didn't do this. I would keep going if I could. We want to make sure that you're still compensated if that's a decision that you didn't make and it was something that the intended parents had made. A mock cycle fee or an ERA, these are becoming a lot more common. Basically, doctors like to see how your body is responding to those medications. And then also with the ERA, it's essentially cycling like you're going to have an embryo transfer, but then they decide to then take a bit of the lining instead of putting an embryo in, and they can test that lining to see if you had the proper amount, I guess in layman's term, the proper amount of time of progesterone prior to when the embryo would be transferred. So it gives them, basically they're collecting data. Oh, look, I've got something that popped up here. Okay, they're collecting they're collecting data on how does your body respond so that we can make sure that we're giving that embryo the best chance possible of sticking. Invasive procedure. Again, it's not that common, but with any pregnancy, there can be things that come up that will, involve some higher risk procedures. So if you have to undergo something, we're going to want to make sure that you are compensated for, the pain of that procedure, but also, like the C-section fee, you may not want to be on your feet, much, or do your standard things. So you may want to order takeout for a couple nights or whatever the case may be. Invasive procedures are typically going to be things like, if unfortunately, like if you needed like a D&C procedure for miscarriage, or maybe like an amniocentesis for some genetic issue that they're looking out for, things to where it is, well, invasive. It's going to have, a large bearing, and you're probably going to have to take some time off of work, or and make sure that your kids are taken care of during that time. Loss of organs fee. Again, we hope this doesn't come up. But there are things that happen during pregnancies that may lead to, a hysterectomy, or maybe you have a tubal pregnancy, so you have to have a tube removed. So we want to make sure that in those instances, that's obviously not something that would happen if you didn't undergo this pregnancy. We want to make sure that you are covered, and that you do receive a bit of compensation for undergoing those. Bed rest fee. So for us, and you're going to see different variations. With Compass, we decided to do a bed rest fee instead of separating out like childcare and housekeeping and those different things. Because first off, when you go on bed rest, the last thing you want to be doing is chasing down invoices and different things for housekeepers and childcare, or trying to find someone that's within like a certain amount of like per week, or per child or whatnot. We find that it's just easier to be like, okay, you're on bed rest, this is the fee that you're going to receive per week. You can decide if you want to use all of it towards childcare, some of it towards childcare, more of it towards housekeeping. It's non-accountable, meaning you can kind of use those funds for whatever makes the most sense for your life. So that's going to be, only if you're on mandated doctor bed rest. Again, it does not come up that frequently, especially with single embryo transfers, singleton pregnancies. We're wanting these pregnancies to be low risk. So very, often you can just continue on life as normal. But if something comes up, we need to make sure your family's taken care of. And then another one that we'll see is breast milk compensation. So again, this is going to be a mutual decision between you and your intended parents. But if you do decide to pump breast milk after the baby's born, and the intended parents would like to have you do that for them, then we'll have fees outlined for that, for you to be compensated for that. I always joke that personally I would carry 10 pregnancies before pumping again, because it is not my thing at all. But for other people, they either enjoy it, or it really doesn't, affect their life that much to where it's that big of a deal, and they love being able to do it. And so I'm like, more power to you. So we want to make sure that compensation is listed out in that fee sheet. Right. Okay. And then reimbursements. So these are kind of like the top things that we actually see as reimbursements rather than fees. The first one's going to be lost wages. Again, we're trying to keep your life as normal as possible. We don't want to have a huge, impact on your day-to-day life. We want everything to kind of stay as it was if you weren't pregnant. But there may be times where you have to travel, and if you need to travel, we want to make sure that if you're taking time off work, that's not coming out of your own pocket, and you're getting those lost wages reimbursed. If you are put on doctor ordered bed rest, that should not be a cost that you're eating. This is not your pregnancy, and so the intended parents should be covering that in the form of your lost wages payment. And also, if you have a spouse or a partner, there's typically going to be a section in there for how much he or she will be compensated or reimbursed for time off of work. In hours, we typically limit that to 10 days, so basically like 2 weeks. People can either use it for transfer, or they can use it, if they need to take off time like halfway through, if there are bed rest issues. Most of the time people will just save it and use it for postpartum, but it just depends on what works best for your family. Life insurance is another reimbursement. We want to make sure that a policy is put in place. Nobody likes to talk about this. It's death. We don't want to ever talk about the possibility of someone losing their life. But if something were to happen during the pregnancy, even if it weren't, pregnancy related, if it's a car accident or whatnot, we want to make sure that you do have a plan so that your family is taken care of. The last thing that we would ever want to see is you potentially losing your life over doing something so selfless, for someone else, and then leaving your family, raw. Obviously, they're already going to be that way emotionally. We don't want to leave them that way financially too. So a policy will be put into place for you, and then those premium payments will be reimbursed or paid for by your intended parents. Travel costs. Again, this is something that you're doing as a favor. You're not going to be responsible for any of those travel costs. So anything, it will all be outlined in the contract as far as the amount that will be covered. But typically it's going to be your airfare is going to be covered in full, typically paid upfront. So you're not having to front that. Your hotel will be covered. Either funds will be sent to you or a credit card authorization will be in place to cover those charges for that. You'll have an amount per day per person for food that will be sent to you for the journey. Some fee sheets will have it written to where you've got to collect receipts and then be reimbursed. With Compass, we just prefer to give you a per diem that you can, it's non-accountable so that you're not having to chase down receipts and whatnot. And then ground transportation. So either like Uber costs to and from the airport, hotel, clinic, or if a rental car is reasonable and, within that same realm of costs as like an Uber would be, then we can do a rental car instead. So we again, we don't want you going anywhere and then being out at those costs. Childcare would also be covered if that's needed. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, your lost wages. Health insurance is the other biggie. So health insurance, there are still quite a few plans that people have, like through their employers, that do work for surrogacy, but there are quite a few that also have surrogate exclusions on it. So in those instances, a new plan will have to be purchased for you. It is 100% your plan, so it's in your name. It is your plan. So that's why we call it a reimbursement, because technically you're paying, whether you're being sent the money or someone else has put a credit card on file for you or whatnot, but you're paying and then you're being reimbursed those costs so that you're not having to, be out that money on a monthly basis. And then, of course, all those pregnancy related medical bills that will also be covered. So I'm gonna run through like what our sample fee sheet is so that you can kind of get your eyes on how this actually plays out. I'm gonna try not to take too much time on it because I already kind of went through them all in depth. But it's sometimes easier to see actual numbers versus just hearing words. I'm gonna reiterate it again. This is a sample, so I like to tell people that if you come to me, you're not like tied into these amounts. These are amounts that I've presented to intended parents as, a typical fee sheet. So if things are like way off, then it could affect matching a little bit. And some people might not be able to afford it or whatnot. But ultimately, we want to make sure that the numbers are matching what works for you and your family. So here I'm showing base compensation. I've got it here for $45,000. We divide it in between 9 payments, so basically being one payment per month of pregnancy. And it's paid up in equal installments up until birth. That compensation is going to be variable. That's going to be the number that changes the most. I have some first timers that come in and they want to be down, like around 35,000. I've got some first timers that are higher than the 45. And then I've got experienced gals that, gosh, it's anywhere from like 45 up to, I've seen in the 60s, depending on the situation. So that's going to be something that nothing is set in stone. I'll just tell you if I have intended parents that can, kind of afford, I hate using that word, but afford those costs or what you're asking, or, if either we might want to look at something a little bit lower, or if maybe my agency might not be the right fit for you based on, what you're kind of needing. Monthly allowance. Again, this is to cover all those little silly fees. We typically have it at $300 a month for the first part of the pregnancy. We find that that's a pretty healthy amount to cover those different costs. And then starting at the 28th week of pregnancy, we typically will throw in like another $100 a month. So especially because your appointments really ramp up at the end and everything, or you're really uncomfortable and maybe want, a massage here or there, that's where that extra bit of funds really does help. Multiples fee, typical to see about 5,000 per extra baby. So like if you're carrying a twin pregnancy, in this case, you would be at 45 plus the 5. So 50,000 would be your compensation. Medication start fee. So it's, like I said, it's like a smaller, little bit to kind of help as you're getting into the process. This one's at 250. Transfer fee of $750. Again, those are just, they're not to reimburse anything or whatnot. They're just fees or compensation that's paid to you. Drop cycle fee. So if the parents kind of pulled out or something happens where the transfer is not going to occur as scheduled, then that we've got that fee of 500. Mock cycle or ERA fee. So like I was talking about with any of those kind of pretend cycles, as I call them, but things to kind of get knowledge off of, those are at 500. Maternity clothing allowance. Sometimes agencies will have like one amount for like a singleton pregnancy versus a twin pregnancy. We just have it. I have an example here of 800. I'll have people, maybe ask for 500 or 1,000. I find that 800 is a pretty good, point to be at to cover the cost of, that you're incurring for those clothing choices and things that you need during the pregnancy. Invasive procedure. So I've got some of the things listed here. So like a DNC, ectopic pregnancy, selective reduction, cerclage, amniocentesis. So things that typically are coming up when things turn higher risk or there are complications. We've got that at 1,200 per procedure that you need to go through. Your loss of organs fee, we've got 5,000 if you have to have a hysterectomy, where it's just loss of uterus, 1,500 per tube and or ovary, and then 10,000 if you unfortunately have to undergo a full hysterectomy where all reproductive organs are removed. C-section fee, we've got a 3,000 again to kind of cover the extra pain and discomfort and the extra help that you may need during that postpartum period. Bed rest, so we've got that at 300 a week. So again, maybe use like 200 a week towards childcare, 100 a week towards housekeeping, or just whatever works best for you. This is just this is what what most people will choose with Compass, but again, we can work with that based on how much childcare it's typically in your area or housekeeping or whatnot. Breast milk compensation. The typical is going to be $2.50 per week or $1 an ounce, whichever is greater. And then of course all your shipping and pumping supplies covered. And then your reimbursements, so lost wages, you're going to get covered for up to 6 weeks for vaginal, 8 weeks for a C-section. So that's fairly typical. And then, of course, if you're on bed rest or work restrictions that reduce down your hours, we just need documentation of that. And then if you have any like non-routine appointments that are related to cycling or the pregnancy, where you're going to have to like travel a whole bunch or a large amount of time is going to have to be taken off of work. We're going to want to make sure that if you're having to take off a full day for something, that you do get compensated for that. And then your spouse or partner's gross wages to be about 10 days is typical. Your life insurance premiums. So I've actually recently upped this to for the coverage to be 750,000, mainly because that is a requirement for one of the states that I am being licensed in. So I'm just going to keep it that way across the board. So right now I've got it listed here for 600, which is plenty for a $500,000 life insurance policy, but depending on the quotes that we're getting, we'll play around with that number. And then travel costs, like I said, so if you've got to drive, you're going to get reimbursed per mile. Childcare for overnight care, you're going to get your food per diem, and then your airfare, hotel, and ground transportation. Okay, so do I have to go with your standard fee package? No, you don't. So it's your journey. So the compensation and fees, they really should meet your needs and the needs of your family. And that will look different depending on, your own, like where you live and your family and how many kids you have, if you work outside of the home. All of those things will play into what you feel is fair for the compensation and fees and reimbursement. But like I've said, it is good to keep in mind what your IPs or the future IPs that the agency may have might be expecting, or what they have budgeted for, which that is why we provide a sample. It's something that before we're even looking at matches, we're giving to both the surrogate candidates and to the intended parents. to review and say, hey, this is kind of what you're going to want to expect, especially on the IP side, so that you can really start budgeting for this. So if you come back and your numbers might be a lot, higher, then it might be a little bit harder to match because not everyone may have prepared for that financially. Same thing though, on the flip side, if you come in and you're like, I don't need some of those, or some of those are kind of high, well, you may actually match a little bit faster, depending on, that's going to be a big, kind of blessing to IPs that might already, be feeling a little bit stretched or whatnot. So we just try to base the numbers or the sample that we provide on intended parent expectations, industry standard, what we typically see, and then common requests that we've gotten from surrogate candidates throughout time. Okay, so all in all, this is what I'd like everyone to remember. Base compensation is what you earn for going through this journey. Okay, that's the money that you're getting for undergoing this process. Fees and reimbursements keep you whole financially. We don't want to add any additional stressors financially to you and your family for going through a pregnancy that is not your own. So anytime that you see a fee or reimbursement, that's to make sure that you are staying status quo as if you were never pregnant. It's keeping you right there at that baseline. Base compensation is what you are earning for going through it. So that's when you're looking at these, I think that if you kind of remember that, then you can start to break it down a little bit better, and it starts to make a little bit more sense. Also, fees are not going to be finalized. Any of those numbers that I went through, they're not going to be finalized until the legal process is underway and you're in legal and you're deciding those to go into your actual contract. But the stronger your compensation and fee package is prior to the matching, or prior, to me showing your profile to someone, the better the expectations are going to be between you and your intended parents, which all in all will make a smoother journey. So I do tell people, really put your thought into this. Let's make sure that you understand everything. Let's go through everything. Let's comb through it. I still want you to talk to your legal counsel once you get there to really comb through it again. But the less changes that are made to that compensation and fee sheet during legal, the better that kind of trust and relationship is between you and the intended parents, because nobody wants to feel like they were promised one thing and then they're getting presented something else. But it is something that I make sure that intended parents and GCs know that that's until you talk to your legal counsel, nothing is really finalized. And so you do have to make sure that you're leaning on them once you get to that point as the experts to really decide if it's working for you and if it's working for the intended parents. So feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to go over any other parts of compensation or surrogacy in general. You can check out the website. It's compassfamilyjourneys.com. Feel free to call me, text me. It's my business phone, but I do get texts on it. And then, of course, email. That seems to be the best way. I'm an emailer. It's family@compassfamilyjourneys.com. I hope you have a great rest of your day.